It is 6:30 p.m. Raise your hand if you've washed your hands in the last hour. All right. The rest of you who didn't wash your hands, you are excused to go and do so before you come back. Glad that you are here tonight. I'm glad that you are staying healthy by washing your hands a lot. Thanks for being a part of this Backstage Pass. So a Backstage Pass is basically me talking about something that I know a little bit about. I'm very committed to being as transparent as I possibly can about the life of the church. And so my hope is to have occasional events like this where I just share a little bit about what I know about the inner workings of the church. I anticipate that future Backstage Passes may not be as well attended because probably something like the endowment fund, Rich, is probably not as interesting a topic as the General Conference 2020 or something like that. But all these sort of things that happen in a church and everybody goes, I wonder how that happens. Those are the kinds of things that I want to talk about and just to share, because there should be no secrets. Everything should be out in the open as much as possible. So this one is about the General Conference 2020. We'll probably do another one of these after the General Conference happens and do kind of a wrap-up thing. But before we go too much further, I would like to read the rules for tonight. There are rules for this session. And the rules are actually contained in the book of Romans, chapter 12. Here's the rules for tonight. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and not all the members have the same function, so we who are many are one body in Christ, and individually we are members of one another. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. Prophecy in proportion to faith, ministry in ministering, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation, the giver in generosity, the leader in diligence, the compassionate in cheerfulness. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Beloved, never avenge yourselves. Leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If your enemies are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil. Overcome evil with good. So these are the rules that we will be following. And I offer them to all of us because the possibility of a lot of emotion is present in this conversation. In this room are people who are very staunchly opposed to same-sex marriage. And in this room are gay people who are married. And in this room are parents of people in the LGBTQ community, myself included. And so, when we talk about these issues, we're not talking about abstract ideas. We're talking about people and their lives and their relationships. And so these are the rules that we're going to follow in our conversation for tonight. The United Methodist Church is divided. There is little doubt that the United Methodist Church as a denomination is divided, but it is not divided in the way that most people think it is. Because the United Methodist Church is not divided between liberal and conservative. The United Methodist Church is not divided between marriage equality proponents and traditional marriage proponents. That is not the prominent division in the United Methodist Church, although, unfortunately, many United Methodists think it is. And I'll talk more about why we think it is in a little bit. The true division in the United Methodist Church is between exclusivists and inclusivists. So, an exclusivist is a person of faith who cannot bear the thought of being in a church with people who believe and practice differently than they do. I'll say it again for those of you keeping score at home. An exclusivist is someone who cannot bear the thought of being in a church with people who believe or practice differently than they do. An inclusivist is someone who can. An inclusivist is someone who wants to be a part of a church with people who believe and practice differently than they do. That's the true divide in the United Methodist Church. So, we have traditional marriage people who are exclusivists, and we have marriage equality people who are exclusivists. We have traditional marriage people who are inclusivists, and we have marriage equality people who are inclusivists as well. The true divide isn't between those who favor traditional marriage and those who long for marriage equality. No, the true divide in our system, in our church, is between exclusivists and inclusivists. Now, this work has been done in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people using some different terminology. And if you've been keeping up on things and reading things, you might have seen the word incompatibilists and compatibilists. That kind of language is more common when we're talking about this divide. But because the word incompatible is kind of fraught with emotional weight, I've chosen to use different words. Exclusivists, inclusivists. Ones who don't want people to believe or practice differently than they do, and ones who are okay with it. I mentioned work that's been done around this division. That work doesn't look like any kind of scientific polling. It looks like gatherings of United Methodists who take kind of an informal questionnaire. And this has been done at annual conferences. This has been done at leadership institutes. This has been done at any number of training events where there are large groups of United Methodists gathered. And they've been asked to self-identify as being in one of these categories. And consistently, at all of these kinds of events, we have a pretty clear idea that 2/3 to 3/4 of United Methodists are inclusivists. 2/3 to 3/4 of us are okay being in a church with people who believe and practice differently than they do, which means that 25% to maybe 1/3 of us are exclusivists. We don't like the thought of being in a church with people who believe and practice differently than we do. And it makes sense to me that this is the division because I've been Methodist my whole life, with the exception of 5 years that I was a choir director at the Presbyterian Church, during which time my grandfather considered me to be the United Methodist missionary to the Presbyterian Church. So technically, yes, but still very much United Methodist. This is actually what's appealing about the United Methodist Church for a lot of people, that we can be in a church where people believe differently, where people practice faith differently, and it's okay. For a long time, our denomination was celebrated as a big tent denomination, one of the few that actually welcomed all people and really meant it when we said that. The open communion table where all are welcome. It doesn't matter what you believe or how you practice. This is an appealing part of being United Methodist, that sort of inclusive nature of our denomination. Being a part of a denomination where people believe differently than we do and practice differently than we do is seen as a strength in our denomination. It's seen as something that helps us to grow and flourish in our faith. So it makes sense when you think about the vast majority of United Methodists are inclusivists. So how do we get into this predicament where we are right now? Well, it just so happens that when you're an exclusivist, when you don't want people to believe or practice differently than you do, you're pretty vocal about it. And you get to define the conversation. So for far too long, the conversation has been defined by the exclusivists. And if you read the news or go to a general conference, heaven forbid, you would think that 100% of United Methodists are in this category. It's simply not true. A minority group belongs here, but it's a very vocal and very well-organized minority group. We even have data around the breakdown within these two groups. So we have data around our inclusivist United Methodists. It varies, but somewhere just over half of United Methodists are traditional marriage inclusive, and just under half is marriage equality inclusive, thinking of the denomination as a whole, right? So of the inclusivists, right, just over half are traditional marriage, just under half are marriage equality. Now, of the exclusivists, the vast majority are traditional marriage. It's always significantly higher when we poll United Methodist groups. The vast majority are traditional marriage exclusivists. So, and this will be a number in the denomination as a whole. In the UMC as a whole, probably 20 to 25% of all United Methodists are traditional exclusivist. Tracking? Making sense with the terms here? And that marriage equality exclusivist estimate is very small, probably single-digit percentage of the denomination are marriage equality exclusivist. So if I'm a marriage equality exclusivist, I'm not only going to want to be allowed to do a same-sex wedding, I'm going to insist that everybody has to do a same-sex wedding, right? If I'm a traditional marriage exclusivist, I'm going to say nobody gets to do a same-sex wedding, right? If I'm a traditional marriage inclusivist, I'm going to say, it's not for me. I don't agree, I don't get it, or whatever, it's weird, I don't know, it's just not for me. But I'm not going to begrudge someone else the opportunity to do ministry in that way. If I'm a marriage equality inclusivist, which, full disclosure, that's what I actually am, a marriage equality inclusivist, I'm going to say, I want to be able to do a same-sex wedding, but I'm not going to insist that my colleague down the street has to do it either. In fact, I would love for my colleague down the street, who is a traditional marriage inclusivist, to be able to refer a same-sex couple to me. A same-sex couple who comes and says, we want to get married. My colleague could say to them, I can't do it, but I know this guy Andy, he's a pretty cool dude. And why don't you go on down and see if he'll do it for you and send him down to me. That's the way a connectional church, it seems to me, should work. And could work because it's most of us, right? It's most of us. It's just most of us are really, we're fine. We're content. We're not stirring the pot. And we're sure as heck not going to general conference, because don't send me to general conference. These folks are like, I want to go to general conference, and I want to throw down, and I want to make a ruckus, and they do, right? But this is not the United Methodist Church. This is not the United Methodist Church. When you read the headlines, you think this is it, right? The United Methodist Church is splintering. No, it's not. We're already splintered. I mean, we're not splintering any more than we always have. We're splintered because we believe differently than each other, and we like it that way. I'll tell you what, though. I don't know what you believe about the spiritual forces of wickedness. So every one of us who joined a United Methodist Church promised to renounce them. Renounce the spiritual forces of wickedness. So if you're a member, you have promised to do that. And I don't know what you think about that. I don't know what you think about what the spiritual forces of wickedness are. But I'll tell you, from my perspective, the spiritual forces of wickedness really don't care who gets to get married or not. The spiritual forces of wickedness really don't care who gets to be ordained or not, because the spiritual forces of wickedness have one item on their agenda. That's keeping us mad at each other, keeping us fighting with each other, keeping us angry and tense and anxious, because when we're angry and tense and anxious, we're not doing what God wants us to be doing, which is loving the world the way Jesus loved the world. Okay, my sermon, thus endeth the sermon. The spiritual forces of wickedness love the fact that we all think the United Methodist Church is here, right? If we're going to renounce that, we're going to say, nah, we're pretty much here. We're pretty much here. And we like it that way. So this is the division in the United Methodist Church. This is the true division in the United Methodist Church. Between this vocal, well-organized minority group of exclusivists and the rest of us who like each other and want to hang out together and be the church together. It just so happens that these folks get sent to General Conference over and over and over again, and have gotten us into this mess. Speaking of mess, let me tell you about the General Conference. So, I'm going to erase this. If anyone wants to write that down or take a picture or whatnot, this is your last chance to do so. Hold that. Can you hold it? Okay. All right, so let's get everyone on the same page with General Conference. We don't decide anything individually in the United Methodist system. We only decide things in groups. The most outer focused group is the congregation, or in our language, the charge conference. So every church has a charge conference. This is my charge. So I'm appointed here. I'm charged to serve here. This is my charge, Manchester. And we have a charge conference every year, at which time we make decisions about the church. Now, many of those decisions made at this level are delegation decisions. Policies that are created and affirmed that delegate the day-to-day management of the church to me, or to the church staff, or to whoever it delegates it to. So they don't have to get together to make every decision, right? But they meet once a year, charge conference, to make the official decisions for the congregation. So we are, as our church, the next concentric circle in is an annual conference. Our annual conference comprises the geographical state of Missouri. So it is very creatively named the Missouri Annual Conference, because we stink at naming things. The Missouri Annual Conference is led by a bishop. Our current bishop is Bishop Robert Farr. He is assisted in that work by a staff as well as 9 district superintendents. Our current district superintendent is Reverend Robin Roderick Bell. We're a part of the Gateway Central District in this Missouri Annual Conference. And if you want to know the inner workings of being a district superintendent, Nancy Dunlap would be happy to tell you all about it. So that's the next conference, an annual conference. It meets, guess how often it meets? We stink at naming things, oh my God. It's an annual conference. It meets every year. Every charge conference sends delegates, sends representatives to go to the annual conference. We have 5 clergy people appointed here, so we have 5 clergy that are delegates and 5 lay people who are delegates. They're part of our nominations process. They're elected to annual conference. The next ring of conferences is jurisdictional conference. Now, the jurisdictional conference is every 4 years, and we are in a jurisdiction that's essentially the south. Like if you looked at a map of the United States, we're in the south central region of the United States, which means our jurisdiction is named the South Central jurisdiction of the United Methodist Church. So Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Nebraska and Kansas are one annual conference, but Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and some of Arizona. That's the South Central jurisdiction. Every 4 years, and the decisions that are made here by this group are basically the election of bishops. That's the most significant decisions that are made here. The jurisdictional conference elects bishops and sends them to the annual conferences to lead, and the bishops ordain pastors and send pastors to the charges to lead, right? Okay, so our jurisdiction is one of several in the United States, and those several jurisdictions come together along with our international conferences to be a part of the General Conference. So it's jurisdictions from all around the United States, plus conferences in the Philippines, conferences all over the continent of Africa, and all over the continent of Europe as well. We have 12 million United Methodists all around the world. We speak 7 or 8 languages. There are 4 official languages, but we speak 7 or 8 languages. And there are 860 from all around the world who come to this event right here every 4 years. The job of this group, by the way, the mission of the church to make disciples of Jesus Christ, to make a difference for Christ in the world, to my knowledge, and I may have missed it, but to my knowledge, not a single disciple of Jesus Christ has been made at this level of the church. At least not in recent memory. All the action happens out here, right? All the action happens out here. This is where the love of Christ is shared in the congregations. That's where the real church stuff is happening. So what does this group do then? Well, this group gets together every 4 years, and they write a book. They write 2 books, actually. They either edit or amend or otherwise alter our 2 books. This is the book of discipline. It has the rules and regulations for being a church, how to ordain people, how to organize your church. I just looked up today, as a matter of fact, who gets to vote at a charge conference is in here. So all the rules and regulations are in here. And then another book that is created at the General Conference level, the Book of Resolutions. This book is a response to what does the United Methodist Church believe about blank? And if our denomination has an official position on a topic, it's in the Book of Resolutions. Now the only group, no single person can put anything in here. It happens only by a group and only by this group right here. Now this group functions pretty much as a legislature. We were created as a denomination about the same time that the United States was born. So we have a general conference, which is the equivalent of a legislative branch. We have a council of bishops, not a single president or pope, methopope, if you will. We don't have a methopope, but we have a council of bishops. So our bishop, Bishop Bob Farr, and all the other bishops, right, are a council. That's kind of like the executive branch. They execute what the rules are. And then we have a judicial council, which is very much like the Supreme Court. I mean, it's judiciary. So this group, the General Conference, can pass something, and then in the first section of this book is actually we have a constitution, right? We have a constitution. So this group can pass something. Someone can bring it to this group and say, "Is that okay that we do that?" And this judicial council says, Actually, no. That's unconstitutional. You can't do that. In fact, in 2012, in the United Methodist Church, at the General Conference in 2012, there was a really innovative idea that like everybody wanted to do. It passed at General Conference. It was restructuring the whole denomination to make it more effective, more efficient, and everybody was on board. And it was a big celebration. Hey, we did this great big thing. Literally, the last day of General Conference, I mean, within an hour of adjournment of the General Conference, the Judicial Council came back with a ruling and said, you can't do that. It's unconstitutional, and took the air out of the balloon. Literally, everyone was on board for this reform, and it didn't happen because our Judicial Council said no. So we have a three-branch government, very much like the U.S. government. Whether that's good or bad, you can decide for yourself. Okay, so that's the basics. I know it's really, really fast, but every 4 years, this group gets together. So I'm going to talk about this group getting together this year. Now, I'm going to be there, Minneapolis, May 5 through 15. I'm going to be there because last annual conference, I was elected by the annual conference to go. I was elected first. I had got the most votes on the first ballot, and so I'm actually the head of the delegation that's going, the head of the Missouri delegation, which means nothing other than I have to sign my name on all the forms and make the room arrangements and make sure everyone's got their plane tickets and everything. I swear, like, if Beth's down with a confirmation class, like, I feel like a youth director sometime, like, you guys, get your hotel reservations made. You gotta, anyway, that's all it means. That's all the head of delegation means. Okay, so I'm gonna be there, which means, lucky me, I have received the legislation that has been proposed for this year. Yeah, there are 747 individual pieces of legislation in these books. 747. There's a joke in there about an airplane bringing it in to land. I'm not sure what the joke is, but 747 individual ideas about how we should somehow or other alter one of these books. Either add something to it, take something away for it, or change. I swear to God, there's petitions in here that like change one word. Like, it would be so much better if we said thus instead of this. Good night. It's ridiculous. And by the way, did I mention that we speak like 7 different languages? So this has to be translated before it can be sent out to all the delegations. And I'm sure nothing is ever lost in translation from one language to another, right? And when we're talking about this on the floor of the General Conference, we have instantaneous translation into multiple languages. So you have people sitting on the floor with headphones, a booth of translators on the side who are listening to the person speaking in one language and then talking into their microphones, which is being transmitted to the headphones of the delegates in the room. And of course, everything's crystal clear in that process. Nothing ever gets lost in that translation either. It is really, really hard to function as the General Conference. It is really hard to function. Just a brief little sketch of how this works. So the first week that we get together, this is a 2-week deal, by the way. The first week that we get together, we divide up into committees. So the 860 people who are there are divided up into legislative committees. The petitions that we consider are divvied out to those various committees. So when we get to the committee, we consider the petitions that apply to our particular committee's work. When I say consider, I mean debate, amend, vote on the amendments, vote to substitute something else, wordsmith, whatever we want to do, we can do it at the committee level. And then the committee either approves or not the petition, and then that goes to the big group the second week. The second week, it's brought to the big group and said, hey, the committee wanted to approve this. They did make this amendment here, and here's the amendment, and they approved it with the amendment, so what do you all think? And then the big group can take it and amend it back to how it was before if they want to, and change it around and shift it around until finally we vote on it. Did I mention there are 747 individual pieces of legislation to do this with? Now, a lot of them can be lumped together. A lot of them can be like, yep, we like this. The committee voted 30-0 to do this one. And so that goes on what's called a consent calendar, gets handled in 10 minutes. Nevertheless, I feel better when I can say 747 and get all the sympathy from everybody. Okay, so that's how things typically happen at a general conference, or not happen, as the case may be. This year, however, things are a bit different. So the deadline for submitting legislation is in the fall. And there were a bunch of, I may have said 747, that were submitted by the fall. And so the translation process started, the distribution process started of all those different petitions. And then in January, a new idea was floated. In January is well after the deadline for turning in legislation. However, a group of people, United Methodist leaders that represent a wide array of theological perspectives, came out with an idea. And the idea they named, did I say earlier that we are terrible at naming things? The name of this thing is the Protocol for Reconciliation and Grace through Separation and Restructuring. I don't even understand the title of the thing. The Protocol for Reconciliation and Grace through Separation and Restructuring. The fact that it has both reconciliation and separation in there. All right, so this is the idea. It comes out, a bunch of people sign on to it and say, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do that. And it's traditionalists and progressives and everyone in between, centrists who just want to ignore the whole thing, don't want to celebrate it or condemn it, just want to say, can't we just get along? You know, the true centrist position, right? So everyone's like, yeah, let's try this. So this legislative piece then comes out. It's a single piece of legislation that is 33 pages long and outlines a way for the United Methodist Church to essentially become fully affirming of all persons, allow same-sex weddings and ordination of people in the LGBTQ community, and at the same time create a new denomination of traditional Methodists who would not allow that to happen. So dividing the church, or however else you want to say it, it would create this new expression of Methodism, a traditionalist expression of Methodism, and allow for the UMC to become fully affirming. So why didn't that ever happen before? That's oh, okay, that's a decent idea. Why didn't that happen before? Well, to be quite blunt, money is why it didn't happen before. Because in this book right here, one of our rules is that church property belongs to the annual conference, not the congregation. The congregation holds the property in trust for the conference. That's why we have what's called a trust clause in this book. So the trust clause had prevented people from leaving because they want their building. They want their stuff. Not just to leave, but to take our stuff with us. They couldn't do that. It was very expensive to do that because you had to pay the conference, you had to pay your apportionments, pay your pension obligations in order to leave the denomination. Well, the protocol figured all that out. The protocol came up with a way to do that graciously and allow groups to leave the denomination and take their stuff with them. So, and also, by the way, to fund the beginning of new denominations. So I mentioned that the traditionalist exclusivist is a larger group than the marriage equality exclusivist. That was over here, remember? So the amount of money designated for the traditionalist exclusivist denomination is more than the amount of money designated for any other denomination that might form, thinking that might be a more progressive Methodist expression. But there's money that's designated for the beginning of a new denomination, and a lot of other details that got ironed out in this compromise That's called now the protocol. So what I might mention, what I might have mentioned is that the deadline for submitting legislation had passed. So now we have the idea, then the actual legislation language itself, but we needed a way to get this before the General Conference, to actually enter it into the record so that we could talk about it. Guess what? We have a rule in the Book of Discipline that allows for an annual conference to recommend legislation go to the General Conference past the deadline. So, I believe it was Michigan. Is it Michigan? I believe it was Michigan called a special session of their annual conference for the purpose of approving this legislation so that it could be sent on to the General Conference. So now this legislation is officially approved. So question, the first week is supposed to be legislative committees. Who's going to consider this one? This is a biggie, yeah? Okay, well, how about we do it this way? This is the current idea. How about we all y'all, how about all of us as a whole function as a legislative committee right away? How about we suspend our rules for a little bit so that we can function all together as a legislative committee and consider it as a legislative committee? Because by our rules, it has to be considered by legislative committee and then by the big group. So if the big group is the legislative committee, then this is how we would do this, and I'm not making this up. We would consider it as a legislative committee. We would adjourn as the legislative committee, and then we would reconvene as the whole group and consider the same thing again that we had just talked about just a second before. I love the United Methodist Church. Isn't it great how efficiently we operate? And then we might be able to consider that legislation. Now, to be completely transparent, the thought of my denomination becoming more than just the United Methodist Church, of splintering in any way, shape, or form, really breaks my heart. It truly does. Most of you probably know, I'm the seventh, my brother and I, as pastors, are the seventh generation in our family to be preachers in the Methodist Church. My dad was a General Conference delegate. My grandfather was a bishop. His mother was a General Conference delegate. In 1939, this is her name tag. The name tag that she wore in 1939 to Kansas City, Missouri. Thank you to Jim Vale for the frame. Does anybody, bonus points if you know this, and if you went to seminary, you don't get to answer. 1939, General Conference. What was the significance for the United Methodist Church, for the Methodist Church in 1939? Big bonus points for who said that? The Methodist Episcopal Church had divided in 1844 over the issue of slavery. So all of us thinking we haven't done this before, we have. 1844, divided north and south over the issue of slavery. My grandmother was a delegate at the General Conference that pulled it back together to become the Methodist Episcopal Church, to become the Methodist Church, actually, at that point. So it's big to me that this is happening. It's really big to me. And as a marriage equality inclusivist, I have a vested interest in this, truly do. However, I'm grateful for the words of Bishop Robert Schnase, giving me this perspective. He said, let's just step back and think about this, not in the heat of this moment, but as if it's 5 years from now. Think about it as if it's 5 years from now. What is a more faithful Wesleyan witness in the world? What would be a more faithful witness in the world? To have two different denominations that are both doing ministry in their own way in a faithful and fruitful manner? Or to have a single denomination that's just always at each other's throats all the time, fighting about this nonstop, beating each other up over and over and over again. And when you put it that way, there was no other alternative than the first one, right? Yeah, it's going to be messy, probably. It's going to have some logistical hurdles that we have to figure out together. It will require a lot of trust. Happens to be in pretty short supply in the United Methodist Church these days. It will require a lot of trust. But in 5 years, if we can do this with grace, if we can do this with love, if we can bless each other on our way, we will have done a really good thing. And those spiritual forces of wickedness who are trying to keep us mad at each other are going to be like, oh man, those Methodists, they figured it out. Darn it, we'll have to come up with another angle to try to get at them. You know, this has happened before, right? This has happened in the Presbyterian Church. This has happened in the Lutheran Church. This has happened in the Episcopal Church. And at the 4:30 session, I was asked, is there anything that another denomination has done in these moments that we can learn from? And I said, yes, we can learn what not to do. Because it was ugly, and it was hateful, and it was bitter. And people talked about each other in horrible ways. Ways that broke the rules, by the way. Ways that made it seem like they hadn't even ever read Romans 12, much less heard of Jesus. Yeah, we can learn a lot from those other denominations because we can learn how to do it well. We can do it with grace. We can do it with love. We can do it loving one another and supporting one another along the way. So the protocol legislation creates this new denomination and allows for traditional Methodists to join it, if they so choose, with grace and with blessing. Another big piece of this year's General Conference has to do with regionalization of our church. It has to do with decentralizing authority and pushing it where it should be, which is out towards the outsides. So there are a lot of proposals, one significant one coming out of the Philippines, which is called, it's called the Christmas Covenant, because they came up with the idea at Christmas this year. The Christmas Covenant would create regional conferences in here as well, so that we in the United States, for example, could meet as a regional conference and talk about matters that were pertinent to the United States. There would be regional conferences in Africa, perhaps, a regional conference in the Philippines and in Europe, so that decisions could be made at that level in ways that make sense in that context. Here's an example. Our pension plan, is subject to U.S. laws and U.S. guidelines and U.S. interest rates and all that kind of stuff. There are delegates from the Philippines and from Africa and from Europe who are debating and making decisions about my pension plan, and they really have no interest in it at all, right? It shouldn't be there. And in this particular case, just to name the reality, we have United Methodist presence in countries where same-sex marriage is legal, and we have United Methodist churches in countries where not only is marriage illegal, being gay is illegal, and punishable by death, by the way, right? You talk about a different context for ministry. So maybe we should regionalize our structure a little bit and allow for a little more flexibility about how we do ministry together. Staying focused on the mission always, the mission that's at the heart of all that we do. So with the potential of a new denomination, with the regionalization of our denomination, I'm hopeful that we can find the trust to actually do this well, do this with grace, do this with love, whatever happens. So for the next 15 minutes, I want to say that I will entertain clarifying questions. Clarifying questions about the process, about what might happen next, about what I presented, things that weren't clear about what I presented. I will not entertain a speech about what you believe. And if I hear you starting to say one, I will ask you, what is your question, please? So that we can get to that. As I mentioned early on, we are a room filled with people who see things very differently, and it's not a great venue for that kind of dialogue. However, clarifying questions are most welcome about anything that I have presented this evening. Yes.
Is there any real early lead or read how the Judicial Council will relate to this?
So the question is there any early indication about what the Judicial Council will say about the protocol legislation? As I mentioned, they can determine if a thing is constitutional or not. What I can say is that there were Judicial Council members involved with the writing of the legislation for the protocol. Now, that does not guarantee that it passes the entire Judicial Council. That's a 9-member court, if you will. But there were eyes on this document from the Judicial Council in its creation, which lends one to think that, yes, it would be passed at that level. Yes.
Can you amend a document or a proposal like that in the midst of trying to resolve or work through the acceptance of it?
So the question is about amending a document like this in the midst of trying to work through accepting it, and the answer is yes. Amendments are allowed and are actually likely to happen. There are specifics in here that were worked out among a diverse group of people using a professional mediator. And the compromise positions that were reached in here, by all accounts, are actually quite miraculous that they got to there. This mediator is well known, nationally known. He mediated some litigation around the Deepwater Horizon well disaster, some 9/11 stuff. He was a mediator there as well. So he's a big shot in mediation. And he helped this group get to some compromise points. I say that to say, if this is amended too much, it goes away. It's such a fragile compromise at this time. If any of those numbers are amended on the floor, it just becomes more and more tenuous. The trust erodes even further. But yes, it can be.
That it gets through.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yes.
If the protocol passes, then exactly what does that mean for the church? Will there be a vote on which way we want to go? Does the staff decide that? And what about people who don't agree with that and want to go somewhere else or
So.
start a new church?
So the question is about the process that's outlined in the protocol. Before I answer, I'll say that's open to amendment and change, and we don't know. But what's outlined in the protocol is an initial group forms a new denomination, and there are stipulations in here about the viability of that denomination. Then the next group that considers it is the annual conference. So an annual conference can leave the denomination for the new thing as a whole. That requires a 57% vote at the annual conference. It takes 20% to call the question, to bring it to the floor, and 57% to approve that at the annual conference level. Then it would come to a congregation. So here's this thing A, thing B. If your Missouri Annual Conference says we're going to be thing B, and then Manchester's like, okay, we'll be thing B, and we just wouldn't have to do anything. But if Manchester's like, we actually want to be thing A, then we take a vote and we go here. Now that vote is outlined in here as a church conference of all professing members, and there's no threshold set. If I remember correctly, it is the church council that's supposed to determine what the thresholds should be for the congregation to vote. Then, if your congregation says, we're going to go thing A, but you actually want to go thing B, you're going to have to find a church that went thing B and start attending there.
Andy, can you clarify church conference and charge conference?
So, thank you. So, a charge conference, and you're next. A charge conference is that thing that meets every year. It's basically the church council making decisions about policy and payment of pastors. So then, a church conference is called for special occasions, and it's professing members. It's not it's not an every year thing. It's called for special events. Yeah.
Currently, gay people can be members of this church, can they not?
That's correct.
And married can be members.
Yes, that's correct.
The only problem is whether you, as a minister, can marry them
Or in the space. Yep.
in the church.
Mm-hmm.
So that's basically what the big argument is right now.
Yes, and ordination. And also, currently, gay people cannot be ordained as clergy by our rules. So those two things. Oh, sorry, I'm going to repeat your question. So he's outlining the status quo. The status quo is that LGBTQ persons can be members of a congregation. LGBTQ couples who are married can be members of a congregation. And the question was, so is the only thing, can they be married in the building or by a pastor? And I said yes, and then also the other piece is ordination. So ordination of people who are gay. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Being real facetious, you're going to get all this done in 2 weeks?
So the question is, are we going to get all this done in 2 weeks? And the answer is, we have a rule that says yes, we will. That every bit of legislation will be addressed by the close of that general conference, even if that means frantically at the end of it trying to bundle everything together. But yes, the hope is that we'll get it done in 2 weeks. Thanks for your question.
Within the judicial council, you said that was a 9-member council?
Mm-hmm.
When they are, how do they decide if something is constitutional or not? Is it a majority?
Yeah.
Do they all have to say yes?
So the question is about the Judicial Council and how it operates. The Judicial Council is a group of 9 people that's elected by the General Conference. And it's kind of a rotation like any church committee. Some people rotate off, some people rotate on. And their decisions are just like the Supreme Court. I mean, it's to vote and majority rules on that vote.
So 5 of them have to agree.
Correct. So 5 is the majority there. I think I saw Rich, yeah.
You mentioned the building and the property, and I would assume that's addressed in the protocol.
Yes.
What about endowments over here? United Methodist Foundation?
Yes, of course, Rich Luz asks us about the endowments. What is that too? We're holding that in trust for the conference. The phrase is property, real and something, not imaginary. I know it's not. What would the phrase be? Anybody? Tangible. I think that is the phrase, real and tangible. Yeah. So yeah, all of our assets belong to the conference. In the protocol, you get them. You get to take them with you. That's that. Yes, sir.
What happens to the agencies, the Board of Global Missions, all of these?
The question is, what happens to the agencies? Now, the agencies kind of reside at the general church level. We have the United Methodist Committee on Relief. We have the General Commission on the Status and Role of Women, et cetera, et cetera. They belong to the United Methodist Church and will continue to do so.
Which branch?
There is not a branch. There's just the United Methodist Church and then the Traditionalist Church. We're not 2 branches of the United Methodist Church. The United Methodist Church remains, and the Traditionalist splinters off from that. So the agencies remain with the United Methodist Church. Now, if the United Methodist Church, I erased it, if the United Methodist Church is going to be 33% smaller, that's going to impact the agencies. They're already planning for it. They're already restructuring and budgeting, thinking it's going to be smaller. So they stay with the UMC. Yes?
Let's say it passes, it goes all the way through. From the time that the general conference says, yes, we'll abide by this, and it gets to the church through making those decisions.
The question is timeline, and how does this all play out for timeline? I want to tell you that the General Conference adjourns on probably adjourns on May 15th. And annual conference, I think it starts June 6th. No, ain't nothing happening this year. I mean, that's 2 weeks. We can't get ready for that in 2 weeks. We don't even know what the outcome's going to be, right? There's no possible way that anything happens as soon as I say that out loud, of course. I find it highly unlikely that anything will happen at annual conference of 2020. Now, possibilities are that if there's something to vote on, it could be voted on at a specially called session of the annual conference, sometime this fall or maybe in the new year. If not, it would be in June of 21. Right? So, I think conferences actually have until the end of the calendar year of 21 to make their decision, so there is absolutely no rush in the timeline as it's laid out. Individual congregations then have until 2024 to make their decision. In fact, our bishop, Bishop Farr, is actively encouraging congregations that he suspects might want to leave to wait. He's actively saying, look, y'all, you have till 24. Make sure you're considering all the implications of leaving a denomination, because that's not a simple thing. I mean, it's just not. It's not easy to leave a denomination. It's not simple. So just give it some time. That's his message to the conferences. And by the legislative protocol, the protocol legislation, we have until the end of 2024 to make that decision. So conference decides here, church decides there. We also have clergy that decide on what they want to do and where they want to go. And a couple months ago, our 5 clergy who are here made a pretty public announcement that we're going to hang with the UMC as it becomes fully affirming and inclusive. And all 5 of us are definitely committed to that. All 5 of us are affirming, inclusive folks and want to see our church become that. So that's our commitment. That's our dedication, the 5 of us. Individual members also, would get to decide about where they go.
By our church, we're not saying Manchester.
By the United Methodist Church, right? Thank you. Yes, sir.
You mentioned like a rotating judicial level.
Uh-huh. Term limits. Oh, are there term limits for these folks here? No, except for bishops. Once a bishop is a bishop, they're always a bishop. They don't become a pastor again. So they're always a bishop. So it just depends on when they retire. Before a general conference delegate, we're just elected once, for one term, 1 4-year term. And then we have a whole new round of elections for the next one. And there's no limit on that, on how many times. I mean, there's people, good Lord. Yeah, you have to be reelected. You have to be elected again. There's people who have gone to, I kid you not, 12 general conferences. And it's like, seriously, you really? I want to tell you this too. We have this weird rule that any single member of a United Methodist Church can submit legislation. Any single member can submit legislation. There is a guy. Should I say his name? This is being recorded. I don't want to. There is a guy who has 41 pieces of legislation that he single-handedly wrote and submitted to the General Conference. One single person. I'm like, dude, what do you do in your life? I mean, why do you write so many petitions? It just clogs up the whole thing. So yes, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of stuff to do. We have 2 minutes if someone has one more. Yes, I'm sorry. You had your hand up way back a long time ago.
Yeah, with what happened last year at General Conference, where it seemed like the traditionalists got the language.
Dan. Why should I be hopeful is his question. Considering what happened in February of 2019, and I hope you all are with me that it wasn't the traditionalists who created that. It was the exclusivists who created it, right? No matter what, it was the exclusivists. That's the divide. But considering that, what should our hope be for this one? Well, our hope is in the Lord, who made heaven and earth. God is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. And so that's where our hope resides. Our optimism is grounded in the fact that just a whole lot of U.S. delegations got together in June of 2019, just a couple of months after St. Louis, and elected people to go to General Conference who are new, who are going to do things differently. Elected people to go to General Conference who are going with different eyes, who are going awake to the reality in a way that we haven't been before. That's the optimism here. The optimism comes from a dramatic change that happened in the United Methodist Church after we all saw the rage, right? The rage that emerged after St. Louis last year. And please hear me, I'm going to say this over and over again. It's not because the traditionalists did something. That's just simply not it. It's because the vocal, loud exclusivists took over the show. And there are forces at work in this world whose only hope is that we stay like this. And they won in February. The spiritual forces of wickedness won in February. So our hope is in the Lord. Our optimism is in the fact that the church, our denomination, has shifted. People are awake in a way that we never, at least in my 19 years of pastoral ministry, have never been before. We can't treat each other like that anymore. We just can't. Not if we've read Romans 12. Not if we've read Romans 12. 7:31, on your way to your car, please wash your hands. And I'll see y'all in church. Thanks for being here. So the question is, if the proposal, that protocol proposal, right, is that what you're referring to, is not approved, then that takes us right back to where we're starting from. Yes, the answer is yes. It takes us right back to here.
And if it is approved,
Yes.
I'm a little unclear, so what happens next at the
You are not the only one who's unclear about that. If the protocol is approved, keep in mind, we're talking about May and then June. This is May 5 to 15. And this is, I think, starts on June 6th. Nothing's going to happen here. I don't see how anything can happen this year at annual conference. There may be a special annual conference that gets called later on after we've had time to sort all this out, or it may be 2021. But nothing happens in this June. That's what I would predict. Nothing happens this June. Yes?
I assume that if we go into this process and we divide the churches, we also have pastors who are divided, and we may have a pastor who is of one side who belongs to the other side. There'll probably be a tremendous shifting of clergy in that whole process as well.
So the question is about how clergy get appointed. It's a great question. And if we have this divide, clergy would also get to associate with one denomination or another, and that is true. So there would be a shifting of some clergy from one denomination to another. I would also say this, theological perspective is already taken into consideration when appointments are made. I'll say that again. Theological perspective is already, currently taken into consideration when appointments are made. The cabinet knows the sense of the congregation and the community and the pastors and tries to align those pastors, among other factors, with their theological perspective, and that would certainly continue under a new system.
Would you clarify the judicial branch? Is it?
Yeah.
I'm very unclear about, is it bishops? Is it?
No. It's a good question. So we have bishops. So every annual conference has its own bishop, and those bishops together comprise a council of bishops. That's our executive branch. We have the General Conference. Those people are elected from every annual conference based on numbers to go to this General Conference and be the legislature. Yes. So every clergy person is eligible for election, and lay people who declare they want to go are eligible for election. So Missouri has 6 clergy people and 6 lay people in our delegation to General Conference. The third branch is the Judicial Council. The Judicial Council is elected by the General Conference and is lay people and clergy from all over the world. It's a relatively small group, and off the top of my head, I don't know how many. It's similar to a Supreme Court. There may actually be 9 on there. I don't know what that is. And they meet, I don't know, twice a year, however often they need to, and to hear issues that come up. So a pastor could come up on charges, and that all gets settled by the bishop, but there might be, a different set of appeals processes, and also to rule on the stuff that this group does. Okay, so three branch system, very similar to U.S. government.
Would you clarify your role, Andy, as lead delegate in this process, please?
I'll tell my history. Clarify my role here. So in 2012, I was elected at Missouri Annual Conference to be on the jurisdictional delegation. Okay, time out. So we elect a general conference delegation, and then we elect that many more again. And that totality comprises the the jurisdictional conference delegation. So our general conference, we have 6 clergy and 6 lay people. At the jurisdictional conference, we have a total of 12 clergy and a total of 12 lay people, right? So the second 6. In 2012, I was elected the second 6, so I went to general conference. In 2016, I was elected 7th. Missed it by that much. I was elected 7th, which put me as the first reserve delegate to General Conference. I went to Portland, and I sat on the sides and watched stuff happen, and then when someone had to step out, it was kind of funny. I mean, there's a little form. Of course, there's a form to fill out, and fill out the form, turn it in, and I would go in. So I'm 7th. Now, one of those 6 was Bob Farr, who happened to get elected bishop in the interim, which means, yay, I get to go in. I get in. So I got the privilege of being a delegate in 2019 at the February General Conference here in St. Louis. So that was 16 and 19. Then we had elections again in 19 in Missouri, and I was elected first in Missouri among the clergy. So that's why I'm head delegate now, just because I got elected first this year around. But I should say, Emmanuel Cleaver, who's the pastor in Kansas City, had 1 fewer vote than I did. So I was kind of mad at him, actually, that I said, Emmanuel, if you want to do this, be my guest. And so we met together as a delegation right after annual conference. I said that, I named that, said we're basically tied here. In fact, all of us are probably within 10, 20 votes of each other, really. And so I would be the head delegate if you want me to, but I'm willing to let someone else do it. And they are all like, yeah, go ahead. So thanks a lot. So that's my role here as head delegate for Missouri. It just means I make travel arrangements. It's not glamorous. I make the travel arrangements, the hotel, make sure they're all reserved for hotels. I run the meetings, that kind of stuff. So, yeah. Yes, sir.
If let's just assume the protocol is approved by the General Conference, what's the possibility of the Judicial Council overturning that?
So the question is, let's assume the protocol legislation is passed at General Conference. What is the likelihood that the Judicial Council will say no? It's a great question. A lot of people are asking it. There were a couple of Judicial Council members involved with the writing of the protocol legislation. Now, that does not mean that it's guaranteed approval. It just means that a couple of people on the Judicial Council have had their eyes on this already, which is very, very helpful going into it. It kind of decreases the likelihood that it would be overturned by Judicial Council. Yes.
Does there have to be a name change so that people know which church to go to now?
So is there a name change involved with?
Can you say United anymore?
Right, can you use the United, can you use the, so other questions would be, what about the cross and flame? What about our symbolism and that kind of stuff? There is a little bit in here about usage of trademarked material. The word Methodist would presumably be carried into the new denomination, and they would adopt a different name but still utilize Methodist in their name. So you would, if it's traditional Methodist church or Wesleyan Methodist church or something along those lines. And I can't remember the specifics about, timeline for all that stuff happening. But yes, it would have a new name, so it would be clearly identified. Yes.
This is going back to Bob Colleen's question. So the Judicial Council is voting on this proposal. Do they have to have, is it a unanimous vote? Is it a two-thirds majority? Is it a
Whew. So, it's a as far as I know, a Judicial Council ruling can be issued by majority vote. So let's say this group passes the protocol legislation. It doesn't matter. I mean, this is a majority vote too, right? But then this group gets a hold of it, and a majority of these people say this is unconstitutional. Well, then it's unconstitutional. I'm pretty sure that's the case. Just Google it. Just Google it. Yeah.
And there are 9 people on the.
There are 9. I was right. All right. How about that? Yeah, in the back.
Are there other denominations, religions that have navigated these waters already? Is there anything that we can learn from their journey?
Great question. Are there other denominations that have navigated this? Anything we can learn from them? And the answer is yes. And most of the stuff we can learn from them is what not to do. Because there really has not been a very gracious, loving one of these. I know I've got dear friends who are Presbyterians, for example, and the Presbyterian church just blew to pieces around this issue. The Episcopal Church, very much the same, very recently. Lutheran Church maybe did it as well as anyone, but there was still a lot of conflict in the ELCA, Lutheran Church, around this. So yes, we can look at their experiences, but there's not much positive, to be honest with you, that we could emulate. But there's a lot to say, we don't want to do it that way. We don't want that level of just animosity and just anger and digging in heels. If we do have a way that's a good compromise for so many different people, let's embrace that, grieve it and mourn it, and be gracious about it and go on about our business. That's a great question, though, yes. Yes? Any division in the seminaries? It's a really good question. So there are 9 United Methodist seminaries and a couple others that are recognized by the United Methodist Church. And I would say that in the United Methodist seminaries, it's fairly clear that they each have a mission to educate all people. So they would count themselves in the inclusivist side of things. You'd be hard-pressed to find a United Methodist seminary that would say, no, we don't want your money for this degree because of your lifestyle or whatever. So United Methodist seminaries are fairly united in being inclusivist. Now, there are some seminaries that are not United Methodist but are recognized by the United Methodist Church that would have official sort of doctrinal positions that they require their students to sign ahead of time. That would be opposed. That would be exclusivist. But no United Methodist seminaries, of which I'm aware. Could be wrong. Yes?
What
question is about the impact on pensions and financial impacts. We are blessed with a really, really wonderful general board that handles our pensions, the General Board of Pensions. Since we can't name things, it's called the General Board of Pensions. This one does have a name, actually. It's called WestPath. And WestPath has already created policies to continue managing the pension plans of whatever new denominations are born out of this protocol. Our pensions are safe. Yes.
What's going to be the name of our church if all this went forward?
Manchester.
Will it be United Methodist or will it just be Manchester, period?
We don't know. I mean, we don't know at this point if it even comes to the congregations for a vote or not. Just unclear.
Who are the other 5 delegates to the general conference?
Okay, I know this. I actually have him. So, Emmanuel, as I said, Emmanuel Cleaver, me, Emmanuel Cleaver, Kim Jenny, Matt Miofsky, Trista Sonker Nicholson, and I'm so much more organized than I thought I was. Look at that. Oh, maybe I spoke too soon. Why am I blanking out? Kim Jenny, Matt Miofsky, Sally Haynes. Those are the 6 clergy people.
Are they distributed across the state?
Yeah, so obviously I'm here. Matt is in St. Louis. Sally's in Kansas City. Kim is in Columbia. Emmanuel's in Kansas City. Yes?
What is it you can do as members
Nice.
to support the process?
Thank you. That's a great question. Well, first and foremost, just keep in mind that we don't know so much as we think we do. And so be patient as we do this, because it's a lot to navigate. It really is. And patience is really, really important. I understand when the protocol first came out, I was actually off that Sunday immediately following. I wasn't preaching, I should say. And I considered staying home because I knew it would be like, oh, here, let's ask him. He knows. I don't know. I just don't know. There's so much that we don't know. And everything can get changed. Darn it, I can't find my delegation list. I was going to tell you the lay people also. So much can get changed between now and then as well. And so just patience is the most important thing. Obviously, prayer is always appreciated. And I can definitely publicize the list of the delegates so that you can pray for them individually by name, because it requires, among other things, we meet monthly, so everybody has to give up a day to drive to Columbia and meet. Plus, we all got to read these, and we got to be familiar with these, at least familiar with these. So it's a lot of work that goes into it. That takes people away from families. It takes people away from churches and all that kind of stuff. So prayers for just peace of mind and focus and clarity of mission and that kind of stuff would be greatly appreciated. And then what I'm always encouraging people is say what you will about social media. Don't believe what you read. What were the headlines when this idea came out in January? What were the headlines? United Methodist Church is splitting. No, I mean that's not right. That's not what was happening. So the media does a pretty good job sometimes of covering stuff, but there's a lot going on here, and most important, we're making a difference for Christ in the world by transforming church and community. That's the most important thing. Stay focused on our mission, stay focused on our ministry, and demonstrate to the rest of the world how to be the church. Not to mention to the spiritual forces of wickedness, right? Stick it in the spiritual forces of wickedness eye. And we're going to do this Jesus thing. We're going to do it right, and we're going to stay focused on it throughout this whole thing. So that's the most important thing I tell folks to think about. Yeah, one more. Oh, did you pull that up? Thanks.
It's Amy Thompson, Ivan James, Jill Wardell, Bud Cummings, John Copeland, and Steve Wells.
So those, if you know any of those names. Yeah, so Amy Thompson, Colette Cummings, Steve DeWild, John Copeland, Jill Wandell, one of my best friends, Jill Wandell. Did I say her? And then there's 12 more on the jurisdictional delegation. Don't ask me to remember all of them. Okay, good. If you want to know, it's out there. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much for being here. There'll probably be another one of these in a little bit that's actually about what happened at General Conference, once we know what actually is going to happen at General Conference, which we don't. I will continue to share as much as possible. If you want to send me a friend request on Facebook, I'll post it on Facebook. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'll post them on Twitter. I'll also share whatever I can in those ways as well. I really do want to be as open and transparent as possible, so as most people know what I know. I just don't know as much as you think I know about what's going to happen next. So let's say a prayer. Dear God, thank you for the possibility of this moment. Help us to reframe it not as uncertainty, but rather as promise, as possibility, to see what new thing you might be doing within us and around us and among us, God. Help us to be faithful to our mission, first and foremost, to make a difference for you in the world, to offer love and grace to people, to share Christ in our words and our actions, to always embody the principles of Romans 12, to love one another with mutual affection, outdo one another in showing honor, to truly reflect the love of Christ in all we do. Help us do that, God, in this really, really weird season that we live in. Love you so much, and pray all of these things in the holy name of Jesus and here in the powerful presence of your Spirit. All God's people said, Amen. Amen. Thank you all very much. Appreciate your time.